Let me start with something uncomfortable. Most of what you learned in school, you've already forgotten. Not because you're lazy, not because you're stupid, but because no one ever taught you how memory actually works. We were trained to repeat, not to understand, to store words, not ideas, to pass tests, not to build knowledge, and the brain doesn't respect that. Here's the secret. Most people miss memory is not storage, memory is consequence. You don't remember things because you tried hard. You remember things because your brain had a reason to keep them. Think about it. You remember jokes you heard once, stories from years ago, embarrassing moments you wish you could delete, no flashcards. Most people believe that remembering something is a matter of effort. They think that if they repeat an idea often enough, write it down enough times, or stare at it long enough, it will somehow stick. That belief feels reasonable, but it's wrong in a very deep way. The mind does not work like a recording device. It doesn't care how many times you repeat something if that repetition carries no meaning. The brain is not impressed by effort. It is impressed by sense. Think about how learning usually happens. A student reads a definition, repeats it, maybe highlights it, and then moves on. For a short time, the words feel familiar. There's a sense of progress, even confidence. But days later, the idea is gone, leaving behind only a vague memory that it once existed. This happens because repetition creates recognition, not understanding. Recognition is fragile. It disappears the moment the repetition stops. Understanding, on the other hand, builds structure, and structure is what memory respects. When something truly makes sense, it connects to other ideas already living in the mind. It stops being an isolated fact and becomes part of a network. The brain is very good at protecting networks. It wants to preserve relationships, patterns, and explanations because those things help it predict the world. A meaningless fact offers no help. A meaningful idea becomes useful, and usefulness is the real currency of memory. You can see this clearly in everyday life. People remember stories better than lists. They remember explanations better than formulas. They remember causes better than conclusions. A story ties events together. An explanation answers a question. A cause gives a reason. All of these create meaning, and meaning tells the brain this matters. Repetition alone never sends that signal. There's also an emotional side to this. When an idea suddenly clicks, there's a small moment of satisfaction. It might be subtle, but it's there. That feeling is not decoration, it's a signal. It tells the brain that a pattern has been discovered. The brain rewards that discovery by strengthening the memory. Repeating something without understanding produces no such signal. It feels dull because to the brain, nothing new is happening. This is why struggling a little can be more valuable than memorizing perfectly. When you wrestle with an idea, ask why it works, and try to explain it in your own words. You are forcing your brain to build meaning. You are not just copying information, you are reorganizing it. That reorganization is what turns short-term exposure into long-term memory. Another way to see this is through explanation. When you try to explain an idea simply, gaps immediately appear. Those gaps are not failures, they are guides. They show you where meaning is missing. Filling those gaps creates understanding, and understanding creates memory. Once you can explain something clearly, repetition becomes almost unnecessary. The idea resurfaces naturally because it now fits somewhere in your mental world. So the real secret is not to ask, how many times should I repeat this? But what does this actually mean? And why does it work the way it does? When those questions are answered, memory takes care of itself. Repetition fades. Meaning remains. Forgetting feels like a personal failure. When information slips away, people assume something is wrong with their memory, their intelligence, or their discipline. But forgetting is not a mistake the mind makes. It is a decision the mind makes constantly. The brain is surrounded by more information than it could ever keep, so it must choose. What we call forgetting is simply the brain doing its job efficiently. Every moment your senses deliver an overwhelming flood of data. Sounds, words, images, numbers, facts. If the brain tried to store all of it, it would collapse under its own weight. Instead, it filters ruthlessly. It keeps what seems useful for the future and discards what appears irrelevant. This filtering is not cruel or careless, it is intelligent design. Forgetting is the system that prevents mental overload. The problem is not that the brain forgets. The problem is that we often give it nothing worth keeping. When information is presented as isolated facts with no purpose or context, the brain has no reason to protect it. A definition memorized for a test has no future value once the test is over. The brain recognizes this immediately. So it lets the information fade, not out of laziness, but out of efficiency. This is why cramming works briefly and fails quickly. During intense repetition, information stays active because it is being used again and again in a short time. But once the repetition stops, the brain reassesses. It asks a simple question: has this helped me understand anything meaningful? If the answer is no, the memory is released. Forgetting, in this sense, is not loss. It is cleanup. There is also a protective role to forgetting. If every detail of every experience remained equally vivid, the mind would be trapped in noise. Forgetting removes clutter so that patterns can stand out. It clears space for insight. It allows the brain to generalize instead of drowning in specifics. In this way, forgetting is what makes understanding possible. Notice how the brain behaves differently with ideas that explain something. When an idea helps predict an outcome or clarify confusion, it gains status. The brain treats it like a tool rather than a burden. Tools are kept close. They are sharpened, reused, and refined. Random facts are not tools. Explanations are. This is also why emotionally flat information disappears so easily. Emotion signals importance. Surprise, curiosity, confusion, or even frustration tell the brain that something unexpected is happening. That signal says, pay attention. This might matter later. Without that signal, information feels like background noise, and the brain is very good at ignoring noise. Understanding changes the brain's judgment. When you grasp why something works, you are no longer holding a fragile detail. You are holding a principle. Principles survive because they can be applied again and again. Even if the exact wording is forgotten, the core idea remains accessible. The brain forgets the surface but keeps the structure. So instead of fighting forgetting, it makes more sense to work with it. Forgetting is feedback. When something disappears, it is often a sign that it was never truly integrated. The solution is not more forceful memorization, but deeper connectio. N. Ask what the idea explains. Ask where it fits. Ask how it changes the way you see something else. Once information becomes meaningful, forgetting stops being the enemy. It becomes a filter that leaves behind only what truly matters. Permanent memory does not come from effort alone. It comes from structure. When the mind encounters something new and manages to organize it into a clear shape, that shape becomes stable. It can be revisited, used, and rebuilt even after time has passed. Without structure, information remains loose, fragile, and easy to lose. This is why understanding, not repetition, creates memory that lasts. When you truly understand an idea, you are not just holding facts. You are holding relationships. You know what causes what depends on what, and what would change if one part were removed. These relationships act like scaffolding. Even if individual details fade, the structure remains, and the details can be reconstructed when needed. The brain prefers this kind of knowledge because it is flexible and efficient. Think of the difference between memorizing a formula and understanding why it works. A memorized formula is a single line stored in isolation. If it is forgotten, nothing leads back to it. But when you understand the reasoning behind it, the formula becomes a conclusion rather than a command. Even if you forget the exact expression, you can rebuild it by following the logic. That ability to rebuild is the hallmark of permanent memory. Understanding also compresses information. Many separate facts collapse into one coherent idea. Instead of remembering 10 disconnected points, the brain remembers one explanation that contains all 10. This compression reduces mental load and makes recall easier. The mind is far more likely to keep one powerful idea than many weak ones. Another reason understanding strengthens memory is that it invites active use. When you understand something, you naturally test it, question it, and apply it in new situations. Each use reinforces the structure. The idea stops being static and becomes dynamic. It interacts with other ideas, forming new connections. Every new connection increases the chance that the memory will survive. Confusion plays an important role here. When you feel confused, it means the structure is incomplete. The brain notices this gap and becomes alert. Once the gap is filled, the relief and clarity that follow act as reinforcement. That moment of clarity marks the idea as valuable. Memorization rarely produces such moments. Understanding does. This is why teaching is such a powerful test of memory. When you try to explain an idea clearly, you are forced to rely on structure. You cannot hide behind memorized phrases. If the structure is weak, the explanation collapses. If it holds, the idea becomes solidified. Teaching doesn't just reveal understanding, it deepens it. Understanding also changes how time affects memory. Memorized facts decay steadily. Understood ideas fade differently. They may become less sharp, but they rarely disappear completely. When revisited, they return quickly because the structure is still there. The brain recognizes the pattern and restores the details with minimal effort. This is why people often say they remember something the moment they need it, even after years of neglect. What they remember is not the fact itself, but the framework that once supported it. The framework guides recall. So if the goal is to remember forever, the strategy is simple but demanding. Do not ask how to store information. Ask how to organize it. Ask how it connects, what it explains, and why it must be true. Build structures, not piles of facts. Once an idea has structure, memory is no longer a struggle. It becomes a natural consequence of understanding. Ideas rarely stay in the mind because they are important. They stay because they are felt. The mind is not a neutral machine collecting information. It is a living system constantly deciding what deserves attention and protection. Emotion and curiosity are the signals it trusts most. When an idea triggers one of these signals, it gains a kind of priority that dry information never receives. Curiosity begins with a gap. Something doesn't quite make sense. There is a question without an answer, a pattern that feels incomplete. The mind dislikes unresolved gaps. When curiosity is triggered, attention sharpens automatically. You don't have to force focus. The mind leans in on its own, searching for resolution. Information absorbed in this state is treated differently. It is not passive input, it is part of a search. Emotion works in a similar way. Surprise, excitement, confusion, even mild frustration. All of these tell the brain that something unexpected is happening. Unexpected events might matter for survival or future decisions, so the brain marks them. That mark increases the likelihood that the memory will be stored and revisited. This is why you remember moments, not minutes, and insights, not pages. When learning lacks emotion and curiosity, it becomes mechanical. The mind follows instructions but does not engage deeply. Information slides across the surface without sinking in. This is why reading something can feel productive while leaving almost nothing behind. The eyes moved, the time passed, but the mind never truly cared. Contrast this with the moment an idea suddenly clicks. There is a shift in feeling. Confusion turns into clarity. The mind experiences a small reward. That reward is not accidental. It strengthens the connections involved in reaching the insight. The idea is now tagged as useful and satisfying. The brain wants to keep it. This is also why questions are more powerful than statements. A statement offers closure. A question opens a loop. Once a loop is open, the mind wants to close it. Information that helps close the loop becomes valuable. Without a question, information has nowhere to land. Emotion also personalizes knowledge. When an idea connects to your own experience, struggle, or curiosity, it stops being abstract. It becomes part of your internal story. Personal relevance is one of the strongest predictors of memory. The brain is wired to remember what relates to the self. This doesn't mean learning must be dramatic or overwhelming. Even subtle emotion matters. A small sense of wonder, a quiet that's interesting, or a moment of intellectual discomfort can be enough. What matters is that the idea disrupts the mental routine. Curiosity-driven learning also changes behavior. Instead of asking, "What do I need to remember?" the question becomes, "What is really going on here?" This shift transforms learning from obligation into exploration. Exploration naturally builds memory because the mind is actively mapping territory rather than copying directions. When emotion and curiosity are present, repetition becomes almost automatic. You revisit the idea because you want to, not because you have to. Each revisit deepens understanding and strengthens memory. The effort feels lighter because it is internally motivated. If something refuses to stick, the problem is rarely intelligence or discipline. More often, the mind never received a reason to care. Introduce a question, create a gap, look for the part that feels surprising or unclear. Once emotion and curiosity are engaged, memory follows. Ideas don't stay because they are important. They stay because they matter to the mind in the moment they are discovered. Knowing something and being able to explain it are not the same thing. Many ideas feel familiar in the mind, comfortable enough that we assume they are understood. But the moment we try to explain them clearly, that comfort disappears. Words hesitate. Logic breaks. Gaps appear. This is not a failure of communication. It is a revelation of what the mind actually holds. Explanation is a mirror. It reflects the true shape of understanding. When an idea is memorized, it can sit quietly in the mind without being tested. It feels solid because it is never challenged. Explanation forces movement. It demands that the idea travel from one mind to another, and only well-structured ideas survive that journey intact. When you try to explain something simply, you strip away memorized phrases and technical shortcuts. You are left with the core. If the core is missing, there is nothing to build on. This exposure is uncomfortable, but it is powerful. The discomfort points directly to what needs to be understood next. The act of explaining also reorganizes knowledge. To explain, you must decide what comes first, what depends on what, and what can be left out. This ordering creates structure. Ideas that were previously scattered are forced into alignment. Once aligned, they become easier to remember because they now follow a logical path rather than existing as separate pieces. There is also an element of precision involved. Vague understanding can survive in silence, but it collapses under explanation. You are forced to be specific. Specificity strengthens memory because it removes ambiguity. The mind prefers clear shapes to fuzzy ones. Explanation creates feedback. When something cannot be explained, the brain recognizes the failure immediately. That recognition triggers curiosity and attention. The mind wants to repair the weakness. Once repaired, the new understanding is stronger than the original because it has survived the test. This is why teaching accelerates learning. Teaching is not about transferring information, it is about refining it. Each attempt to explain sharpens the idea. Each question exposes an assumption. Each confusion reveals a missing connection. The idea evolves with every explanation, becoming more robust and more memorable. Even explaining to yourself has this effect. When you try to write or speak an idea in your own words, you engage different parts of the mind. You are no longer recognizing, you are producing. Production requires deeper processing than recognition. Deeper processing leads to stronger memory. Explanation also encourages simplification. To explain well, you must remove unnecessary complexity. This does not weaken the idea, it strengthens it. Simpler structures are easier to store, easier to retrieve. Complexity that is not essential becomes noise, and the brain is quick to discard noise. There is another subtle effect. When you explain something, you take ownership of it. The idea is no longer something you encountered, it is something you constructed. Ownership increases value, and value increases retention. The brain remembers what it has built more readily than what it has borrowed. So the ability to explain is not a bonus skill added after learning. It is the learning. If you want to know whether something is truly understood, try to explain it clearly without relying on memorized language. If you succeed, the idea is already stored deeply. If you fail, the failure is a gift. It shows exactly where to focus next. Memory strengthens not when information enters the mind, but when it leaves it clearly. Most information is temporary by nature. It arrives, serves a short purpose, and fades away. This is not a weakness of the mind, but a strength. What lasts are not individual facts, but the mental models built from them. A mental model is a way of seeing how something works. Once formed, it becomes a lens through which many situations can be understood, even if the original details are forgotten. Facts are fragile because they stand alone. A date, a formula, or a definition has no defense against time unless it is tied to something larger. Mental models, however, are defended by usefulness. They explain patterns, predict outcomes, and guide decisions. The brain values these functions and protects the structures that provide them. When someone memorizes facts, they accumulate weight without leverage. Each fact must be recalled individually. If one is lost, nothing replaces it. But when someone builds a mental model, many facts collapse into one understanding. The details become interchangeable. If one detail is forgotten, another can fill the gap, guided by the model. This is why experts often seem to remember less but understand more. They may not recall every number or term, yet they can reason their way to the right answer. Their knowledge is not stored as a list, but as a framework. Frameworks are resilient. They survive change and time. Mental models also encourage transfer. A fact applies in one situation. A model applies in many. When the brain notices that an idea keeps reappearing in different contexts, it elevates its importance. Repeated usefulness reinforces memory far more effectively than forced repetition. Another advantage of mental models is adaptability. The world is not static, and neither is knowledge. Models can be updated. New facts can be absorbed without rebuilding everything from scratch. This flexibility makes models future-proof. The brain prefers investments that can grow. Learning that focuses only on facts often feels exhausting. There is constant pressure to remember more, with little sense of progress. Model-based learning feels lighter. Each new insight strengthens the whole structure. Instead of piling up information, you're refining a small number of powerful ideas. This approach also changes how forgetting feels. When facts fade, panic follows. When a model rim ains, forgetting details is harmless. The understanding is still there. The details can be recovered or reconstructed when needed. This reduces anxiety and increases confidence. Mental models also support creativity. When ideas are organized into models, they can be combined. One model can interact with another, producing new insights. Facts alone cannot do this. Creativity thrives on structure, not accumulation. Building mental models requires patience. It means slowing down and asking deeper questions. What is really going on here? What stays the same when the surface changes? What explains most of the behavior with the fewest assumptions? These questions push learning beyond memorization and into understanding. Once a mental model is formed, memory becomes effortless. The model acts as a magnet, pulling relevant details toward it. Learning becomes additive instead of repetitive. Each new fact strengthens the model rather than competing with existing information. In the long run, facts will fade. This is unavoidable. But the way you think about the world does not have to. Build models and memory takes care of itself.